Spectacle. In Paris, they celebrate the French Revolution.
From ABC, this is World News Tonight with Peter Jennings. Reporting tonight from Paris.
Good evening. Here in the French capital today, they celebrated the past and they worried about the future. France intended it that way. President Mitterrand actually had the economic summit of the rich industrial democracies postponed to coincide with celebrations for the 200th anniversary of the French Revolution. François Mitterrand invited a lot of people, and almost 1 million came. You wouldn't see a military parade like this in the Soviet Union these days, but this is the way the French like to mark the Parisian assault against the Bastille, which started the revolution in earnest. Besides, it's a wonderful way to advertise. After the U.S. and the Soviets, France is the largest supplier of arms to the world, and much of the world is watching. 5,000 soldiers, 250 aircraft against the backdrop of French history. The Arc de Triomphe, begun by Napoleon to honor the military. The Place de la Concorde, where King Louis XVI lost his head to the guillotine. The 32 heads of government invited by the French to participate today watched from behind bulletproof glass. Lunch at the Quai d'Orsay, the French Foreign Ministry. President Mitterrand's carefully orchestrated effort to get the rich and the not-so-rich nations to mingle. It was to have been the last opportunity. But when word got around that the Industrial Seven were having a dinner tonight in one location and the others a dinner elsewhere, the embarrassed French arranged for all to eat at the same location, in the same building, but in different rooms, which means more mingling time in the hallways, presumably. When the Economic Summit was formally opened, they talked about their agenda for the weekend. Two of the big items, third world debt and the cost of cleaning up the environment. President Mitterrand will suggest a worldwide effort to gather data on exactly how badly man is treating his planet. The U.S. wants the information, but fears it could be an excuse to put off the job of cleaning up. Tonight's parade was billed as an international extravaganza. But it was led in a somber way. Chinese students who live in France wheeling their bicycles slowly down the Champs-Élysées. To honor a great country, said one, with a very sad people whose own revolution was thwarted in Tiananmen Square. The 7 leaders of the world's great democracies rose to their feet as the Chinese walked by. For the rest of the night, it was fun and often outrageous. The Florida A&M marching band moonwalking down the Champs-Élysées. And finally, the anthem, which has stirred man wanting to be free ever since it was written in the middle of the Revolution. Sung by the American opera star Jesse Norman, the Marseillaise. The French indeed have a passion for spectacle. In all the years they've been holding these economic summits, there has never been an opening act quite like it. President Bush was there tonight, and he seemed to be having a very good time. Speaking of opening acts, the business of the summit is going to be done in a conference room above that enormous arch. As we said, the president was at both parades today. He seemed to enjoy himself. Here's ABC's Brent Hume.
President Bush had a good seat at the parade today, right next to French President Mitterrand. But this was clearly France's day, and the vast procession of French military hardware, some of which roared by overhead through the Paris sky, seemed to impress Mr. Bush. In fact, he seemed more interested at times than Mitterrand did. The president may have come to Paris from Budapest, where the sight of tanks in the streets is still a frightening memory. But Bush aides said he did not find today's parade distasteful.
Well, it was advertised as a military parade, and it lived up to its billing.
This afternoon, Mr. Bush joined his economic summit partners for the obligatory group picture, and they got their first chance to sit down together, which also gave some American photographers a chance to get to know some French security men. Earlier, the president met with Mexico's President Salinas, which brought into focus one of the issues at this summit, Mexico's huge and at this point unpayable foreign debt. The U.S. is trying to help Mexico get a deal for relief. Regardless how that turns out, the man to see about third world debt at this summit is Japanese Prime Minister Uno, who has offered to help with more than $30 billion, the kind of money people used to look to the U.S. for. In fact, as he waited to meet with Uno today, the president made it sound as if the Japanese leader was the one who knew what was going on here.
Have to find out.
The French military might and Japanese economic muscle in evidence here owe much to the success of U.S. policy after World War II. But the growing power of such nations has cost the U.S. much of its dominance. Success, like failure, causes its own problems, or challenges, as presidents like to call them. Britt Hume, ABC News, Paris.
A note from Poland, where President Bush began the week. The political deadlock there may have been eased. The independent trade union Solidarity reversed itself today and said he was ready to support the election of General Wojciech Jaruzelski as president. Jaruzelski had said he would not run in the face of Solidarity opposition, and there's no word now if the general will actually change his mind. Later in our broadcast from Paris, a most remarkable American woman who fought in the French resistance during World War II, and our person of the week, a visionary of monumental proportions. But Diane Sawyer is now in New York with some of the day's other news. Diane?
Peter, from here tonight, in a moment, more
And in France, as the saying sometimes goes, he's particularly interesting at this moment in French history, 200 years after the French Revolution overthrew the monarchy.
L'anniversaire, le bicentenaire de la Révolution.
I feel very strongly about the bicentennial. It was the birth of the Republic, the birth of modern times. It was the beginning of democracy. France represents the rights of man, the fighting for the liberation of man.
François Mitterrand is a socialist, and he has been the president of France for almost 8 years. But everyone here seems to agree that socialism isn't what it used to be, and millions of Frenchmen commonly refer to Mitterrand as king. President Mitterrand, as host of the world, has enabled Frenchmen to spend these few days at the very center of the international stage. The French have always known that if you want people to think you're important, it helps to act like you're important. Everywhere you look, François Mitterrand is being important. There isn't much appetite for revolution in France these days, and if the French have never tired of royalty altogether, Mr. Mitterrand appears to millions of his fellow citizens to follow well in the footsteps of Napoleon and Charles de Gaulle.
Alors là, je proteste.
I don't agree that there's been any abuse of power. In the last 8 years, give me a single example where a French citizen's rights were abridged and he was unable to defend himself.
Those on the right complain about the $30 million in taxpayers' money for a celebration in which so few French appear to be interested.
Il a donné les chiffres.
People have given figures of how much money we're spending, but it's much less than the U.S. spent for the birthday of the Statue of Liberty.
Those on the left complain that in the glitz of the celebration, Mitterrand has neglected the kind of ordinary people who were the nucleus of the revolution 200 years ago. Anyone seeking to make the imperial connection need only to look at Paris. Mitterrand calls them the grand works, and he is the godfather of more grand works than any French leader since the kings. The Crystal Pyramid, which exists, or tries to exist, in harmony with the ancient buildings of the Louvre Museum. The brand new Opera House, built on the spot where Parisians stormed the Bastille and ignited the revolution. The Opera House almost caused a second revolution in the neighborhood. And l'Arche de la Défense, the Grand Arch, built in the heart of what Mitterrand wants to be the European business center of the next millennium. The French seem to enjoy having fun at their president's expense. He is portrayed as a frog on a popular television show and often referred to as God. Perhaps it's the price one pays for having been part of the French political landscape ever since the Second World War. There is, of course, so much more to Mitterrand, the most literate of leaders. He can quote at length from all the great writers of French history. He's accused of trying to impress the rich nations this weekend, but no one has been a more ardent advocate of the underdeveloped. And if the French think he is trying to reign rather than govern, well, the French have never objected to being at the center of the universe.
I'm very proud of France and for France. These people didn't come here to see me. They came for the sake of France and for the Republic.
And so we choose François Mitterrand, who we're told has a very dry sense of humor. On a more serious note, he says that freedom is like a fragile bird. And he reminds us quite fittingly on this particular weekend that liberty and democracy require a permanent effort. Just before we leave you, take a look at what they're watching on French television at this time of night. People all over this great city of Paris. That's the Arc de Triomphe, and those are some of the people staring up into the night sky at probably the best fireworks display they had seen here in many years. And that's the voice of the French commentator you hear as old and young wander through the Place de la Concorde and up and down the Champs-Élysées after having witnessed today where people came from all around the world to celebrate the 200th anniversary, the bicentennial of their revolution. A revolution about which the French themselves don't appear to have felt particularly strongly throughout the year, at least until tonight. But take a look at the Champs-Élysées from where we are at the modern, futuristic end of France, all the way down to the historic Centre-Ville, this great and exciting city which so many Americans have visited. That's our report on World News Tonight. We'll be back in New York on Monday. My thanks to Diane Sawyer. I'm Peter Jennings. Have a good weekend. Good night from Paris.